I don't know how to, I'm trying to be charitable here, Joseph. So you tell me which is the more charitable interpretation about what James Martin is doing. Is he either A, just grossly ignorant, or B, is he trying to deceive people?
Blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am honored today. This podcast has been a long time in the plans because I've wanted to talk to Professor Gagnon for a long time. So I think most of you know who he is if you've read anything on the topic of homosexuality, the Bible, Christianity. But here's a quick bio of Professor Gagnon. Robert Gagnon is an American theological writer, professor of New Testament theology at Houston Baptist University since 2018. Former associate professor of the New Testament at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, an expert on biblical homosexuality, and an elder in the Presbyterian Church, correct?
Yes,
okay.
For the time being.
Okay. He holds a BA from Dartmouth, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. So Professor Gagnon ticks all the qualifications. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to speak with him for so long, and because I've been aware of his work for years. And I wanted to speak to him specifically on this issue of homosexuality and as it relates to Holy Scripture. And it's interesting that I'm talking with a Catholic or a Protestant because, or a non-Orthodox, although I've had a lot of Orthodox priests and friends very much willing to talk about this subject at length. In Roman Catholicism, no, and it's not from a lack of asking. I've asked a lot of priests, not so much lay people. I haven't really met a lay person with near the qualifications as Professor Gagnon, but I keep trying to make it French. Sorry.
I have no objections to that.
Okay. But there's a lot of fear in Roman Catholicism surrounding this topic, specifically when it relates to one of its main progenitors or one of its main advocates, that's the Jesuit James Martin. I've actually had Roman Catholic priests tell me that they cannot broach this subject specifically publicly. I mean, they'll do so privately with me, verbosely, but publicly they will not broach this subject specifically in terms of this Jesuit. Who seems to have a lot of power and a lot of influence in Roman Catholicism, specifically the Vatican at this point right now. So it's troubling that in order to refute, answer, correct some of these statements that he's made, I have to go to someone outside Roman Catholicism. And that's where you come, it's just the state of where we're at right now. With your permission, Professor Gagnon, can I give a little background just on what we're going to be talking about real quick?
Oh, I actually thought you were going to tell me that, but all I know is we're talking about homosexuality in the Bible and maybe some correlations with Martin and some other figures. You did mention the fact about the difficulty of finding persons within the Roman Catholic tradition on this question. And that's true also of the Protestant traditions as well. And I suspect some Orthodox traditions also. It's an issue that people feel if they talk about, they'll pay a price for supporting the Orthodox position. In fact, it's very interesting. Just 2 days ago, I was speaking with a person, I think it was Russian Orthodox. I just happened to be going to my car in a parking lot here at HBU, and he stopped me and he said, "Are you Robert Gagnon? Guilty as charged." And he said, "I think I know he was Orthodox, and I think he said Russian Orthodox of all things like you." And he had a very good priest, apparently, that actually his priest recommended me to him, and but we noted in the course of conversation how infrequently people are willing to talk about this issue without fear of the repercussions that would arise from doing so. Just so many people are concerned. How will it affect my job? Will I lose friends? People not listen to anything else I have to say once I talk about this. And I had to hurdle that too at an early stage when I began writing on this back in the 1990s. And, you know, and then it wasn't as bad then as it is today. And now many additional doors are shut. When my book came out in 2001, I was being asked to speak at a lot of mainline denominations. They were still having debates about this issue. But it's been a long time since I've been invited to anything like that, because almost all of them have resolved in favor of supporting homosexual unions. And most of when I started writing about this back in the 1990s, most of the literature that was out there at that time that was, you know, reasonably within the bounds of orthodoxy on this question, they were very apologetic about it in a negative sense, not the classic sense of apologetics, which is good, the defense of the Christian faith, but apologetic in the sense that they felt that they had to apologize to anyone for supporting the biblical position. Pretty much what they came out with saying was, well, if it wasn't for the Bible, I wouldn't be supporting this position that I hold now against homosexual practice. And I thought, really? Wow, what a defense. You know, you're already saying that you don't really think you have a supportable and intellectually reasonable position. So why would anyone want to hear anything you have to say on the question? And what I had to resolve for myself up front is, if I'm going to talk about this issue, first, I'm going to have to settle for myself what my convictions are based on the Word of God, based on philosophical arguments, based on scientific arguments, and then not be ashamed to talk about it. I knew a lot of people when they did start talking about it, because they indicated that they were ashamed to have that point of view, they were eaten alive by critics because they sensed that there's blood in the water. So right from the very beginning, I determined that would not be the case for me. If I wasn't clear on the position, if I had doubts about it, then, well, yes, I should have an appropriate lack of conviction accordingly. But if I have internal conviction about the arguments for this position, then I should never be ashamed about it. Early on, I think the maybe first or second year after my book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, came out in 2001, I was giving a presentation at a UCC church, United Church of Christ, which tends to be a very liberal denomination. You know, we call it the Unitarian wannabes sometimes, but this was in a relatively more conservative venue, but it had people from all different theological persuasions coming. And there was a lawyer who was present from that community in North Carolina. And apparently he was hot stuff and was used to throwing his weight around. And so after I finished my presentation, I'll never forget, he said, "You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself." Oh. And he went on and on and on for like 10 minutes about how ashamed I should be, at the end of which I thought, is there a question here somewhere? But, you know, for a while, I actually felt a little bit ashamed because, you know, when you're being yelled at and upbraided in front of others publicly, you know, you feel a little bit awkward at least. And then I momentarily had to pause and say, no, wait a minute. Have I said anything, either in the way I said it or in the content of what I said, for which I should be ashamed? Well, it took me all of a split second to realize I hadn't. There's no reason then for me to be ashamed. So then I came back at him, not yelling at him, but just reasonably, lovingly asking him then, if I'm to be ashamed, what precisely that I said should I be ashamed about? And can he make an alternate case from the one that I provided here? Well, at that point, he didn't have anything. I guess he was so used to simply making people ashamed who had an orthodox position on the issue. They just shut up and never responded with any sort of intellectual arguments. And when I came back with him with an intellectual approach to the question, he had nothing, sat down and was quiet. For me, it was clear when I look at the biblical text, for example, the text in Romans 1:24 to 1:27, Shame comes from the practice of homosexual behavior, not from the opposition to it. Paul calls it askemosune in Greek, which is the word for, you can variously translate it, but I like the best translation is simply an indecency. But it can also be rendered shameful or shameless acts, as it sometimes is. And so it's the behavior that Scripture tells us that is shameful. And the reason why Paul proclaims it as shameful, he also correlates it by calling it dishonoring, self-dishonoring behavior, because it effectively treats, if one is male, one's manhood or masculinity as only half intact in relation to one's own sex. Or if you're a female, it treats your femininity, your essential womanhood, as only half intact in relation to other females. Now, for all of us, our sexuality is not completely holistic, right? Because in a sexual spectrum involving male and female, clearly a male, as in our case, does not occupy the totality of the spectrum. There are women, yes, and the same thing for women with regard to men. Each of us only offer half the total sexual spectrum, but we are whole in our identity as male or in our identity as female. Nobody is half their own sex. They are half of an integrated sexual whole. And even if one doesn't get married, one still has to, for example, as a male, present yourself as male, not present yourself as female. And the problem with homosexual practice is it solidifies a lie about oneself, that one is only a half male or half female, needing to integrate sexually with somebody of the same sex in order to complement what is lacking in their masculinity or femininity. When the reality is that form of behavior only reifies the lie.
Yes.
That you're not wholly male or that you're not wholly female, that you need to extract it from the person with whom you're engaged in sexual intercourse. And that's why Paul talks about this as self-dishonoring and indecent behavior, because it takes something sacred to God, the stamp of gender that God places on each human being, and it makes it of no effect, which is basically impugning the Creator himself, that you have done a bad job here. Sorry, I don't think that was even your starting question, but
no.
Off the races began. And I went, all that was simply to circle around to say about this whole question, why is it that people who are usually, otherwise might be talkative and engaging, and when they come to this issue, they clam up.
Right.
And they're driven completely by fear, and they allow others who are speaking the lie to control the narrative. And I'm willing to say, to anyone, like anytime I'm in a debate on this question with somebody, which I rarely get to do anymore, because hardly anyone, people won't debate me on this subject. I don't know why. I always have a good time when I do it. And my thought is, if you're not ashamed of your position and you think you have an intellectually respectable position, then why wouldn't you want to?
Yeah, they don't.
But they don't because they know that they don't really have a case. At any level. They don't have it certainly don't have it on the level of Scripture. On
an emotional level, they do. That's it.
Right, exactly. And also they're very good at being outraged. I will always give them that. Those who are promoting the position favoring homosexual practice and transgenderism, they are just unbelievably good at being outraged by everything.
Yeah.
But okay, well, you're going to be outraged, but you have to have some good grounds for being outraged. So you still have to be able to intellectually present your position in a way that sounds convincing and persuasive to others. Otherwise, it's just this vacuous outrage. It's being outraged for the sake of being outraged, or it's being outraged because, gee, I hold this position, I can't defend it, and I'm outraged that anyone would call my position into question. Well, that is entirely lacking in integrity, right? I don't care about a person's outrage. Give me your arguments. What's your best case that you can make for the position that you say, you insist I must hold, and if I don't hold, I'm transphobic and homophobic, whatever that means.
Sure.
I bet you, Joseph, get called. In fact, I think I've seen it, that people have called you homophobic.
Yeah, bizarre.
Bizarre, really super bizarre.
Yeah, I know. I was trained at Berkeley in history and art history. I love historical context, which is going to come up again in some of my questions about you concerning the Bible. But I just kind of wanted to lay out for people a little bit, because their heads might be spinning a little bit. How did we get here in 2022? And I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination in terms of Protestantism or anything non-Catholic, but I have delved quite deeply into how the Catholic Church got here, where you have a James Martin, a Jesuit. Specifically, it looks like in the 1970s, especially around that year, 73, when homosexuality was removed from the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, the DSM.
Right.
Was that 73? Yeah. So it was the same year as Roe v. Wade. So 73, yeah. And believe it or not, there were a lot of Catholic priests involved in the gay civil rights movement at that time, specifically Jesuit, who were in and out, half in and out of the closet, whatever. So probably the main one at that time was John J. McNeill, was a famous
that's what I was going to say, McNeill.
He wrote probably the first pro-gay Catholic tome, The Church and the Homosexual. It was huge when I was a little boy, or I was just a little kid. But from what I've read, it made a big splash. He was on Phil Donahue, and he was one of the big celebrity priests in the 1970s. He was living a double life, of course. He had a homosexual lover. He eventually left. Well, there's a lot of, as everything in Catholicism, it's difficult to get a straight answer, no pun intended. But was he out of the Jesuits? Was he Jesuit, even though he had married his same-sex lover? Anyway, I'm getting off track. And then you had the outcropping of these LGBT ministries like Dignity, which had the backing of a lot of Roman Catholic bishops at the time. They served masses and celebrated masses. And then you had Robert Nugent and Janine Gramick. He's passed on, she's still around. And they started New Ways Ministry, which was another gay affirmative ministry. She's very closely tied with James Martin, and recently Pope. She had been officially silenced in 1999 under JB2 and then Cardinal Ratzinger for her just pro-gay marriage stance. Recently, but again, in Catholicism, that was kind of a meaningless paper because it was never enforced. She continued to write, publish, speak. Recently, Pope Francis praised her for her work publicly. Yeah. So, it's very sad. He has done the same thing with James Martin, because it does give them a certain cachet, because I've gone to some of their speeches, and right away they go, look, this is what Pope Francis said about me. And a lot of Catholics will sit there rightly and go, oh, well, this is okay. In the 80s, a lot of Catholic outreach towards the gay community or the LGBT community switched from civil rights to more AIDS care, which is good. It was a noble thing they did. Mother Teresa's sisters got involved, and it was much less associated with political aspirations in the forefront, but there was in the background, because I remember a certain priest in San Francisco in the 1980s who said, I'm going to marry them instead of bury them, because he felt that homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage, was the answer to the AIDS problem. Because at that time, AIDS had 100% fatality rate at the time. I mean, when I came out in 1988, it wasn't a great time to come out. So a lot of Catholic priests were saying, especially those who worked with the gay community, that we need to have marriage. So, I mean, I went to same-sex marriage blessings in San Francisco many, many times. It wasn't a big deal. They usually weren't held in churches, but they were held in the parish hall, somebody's backyard, whatever. Advocacy in terms of that in the Catholic Church has been going on for a long time. Into the 1990s, you still had a lot of advocacy for this sort of I don't know what you'd call it. For the sake of this conversation, Dr. Gagnon, let's call it queer theory or queer theology. This queer theology, I think in the 90s, you saw it more taking not an intellectual or academic, like I read John Boswell in the 90s. He was a big deal. He was Roman Catholic. Was he at Harvard? No. He was at Yale.
Yeah.
Yeah, Yale. He died, I think, in 94. So he was writing about same-sex marriage contracts, correct me if I'm wrong, in early Christian Byzantine, I can't remember.
Yeah, he did two books. One was a more general book on homosexuality, and the other was on issues about marriage contracts in the medieval period.
Yeah, okay. And if you went to, with Father Photius, people listening at home, an Orthodox priest, I went over that. He answered a lot of those questions. And then I think somebody had given me John J. McNeil's book at that time, which was in another edition, but I don't think I read it. But then, of course, into the 2000s, the Jesuits were still much involved in this. And then when I came out of the homosexual lifestyle, I don't know what you call it, when I came out of homosexuality, the mindset, I always thought that this sort of queer theology was kind of endemic to like Berkeley, the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and San Francisco, where it definitely made footholds in different parishes, because I had heard a lot of this stuff for a long time. And then I started writing about it a little bit, about queer theology. And then people, I didn't solicit any responses, but people started sharing stories about their experiences at gay affirmative parishes, in Catholic LGBT ministries, in New York, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Baltimore, DC, Boston. Usually, a lot of times the nexus was around a Jesuit university. Interesting enough, Chicago. I don't know, I can't name all the places, but then I started researching this everything in the context of these gay affirmative ministries and parishes. And what I discovered is there's a vast network. I didn't discover it, but what I realized is there's a vast network in Roman Catholicism of these ministries who had been promoting queer theology or queer theory for a number of years, which I didn't know. Then James Martin came out with his book, and the Building a Bridge was kind of a Trojan horse, I think, because the book was kind of nothing. I think like a lot of his books and like a lot of modern Jesuit books, it's just poorly written, it's poorly researched, there's very few footnotes. Like my book that I wrote, which is essentially an autobiography, had 300 footnotes. But I mean, what that book did was, like I said, it's a Trojan horse, because I think he already had access to a vast array of parishes and ministries where he could speak, and then he could be more explicit about what he was trying to promote and what in the direction that he thought the Catholic Church should take. And that's I think that's where we're at right now. And I think that's where the fear came from, because for whatever reason, well, no, I know the reason. Priests have told me that their bishops have, I don't know how things work in Catholicism. I don't know how it works. You probably have tenure, don't you, Professor Gagnon?
They don't have tenure at Houston Baptist University.
Okay, that kind of sucks. Okay.
I had it at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, but that didn't apparently help me toward the end.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, so priests have, I think, been explicitly warned not to talk about this priest, this Jesuit priest. So there's fear around it. And a lot of times these parishes, these pro-gay parishes, New York is a good example, are quite wealthy parishes. Let's look at Santa Monica in LA is quite a wealthy parish. A lot of influential people go there, and it's a hub of this queer theology. So there's a network, it's a nexus of wealth and queer theology and fear, and it's a mess. So sorry, I want you to speak, but does that help you at all? Because I know you're coming from a different background.
Well, the reason why most people are quiet on the question is simply they don't want to be labeled bigots. And this is the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer elements have simply framed the question in such a way that if you disagree with their extreme left-wing sexual ideology, you're the moral equivalent of a racist.
Do you
and
think
nobody
that
wants that?
Yeah. Do you think it's the boy who cried wolf? Do you think people are buying that anymore? Because it seems like, I mean, like you said, I'm homophobic. You know, I was a gay porn actor. I came out in 1988 when it wasn't cool to be gay. You know, where were these people? So, I mean, they're throwing it at everybody. It doesn't work.
Well, I think people may not believe it about themselves, but they are worried that other people will believe it about them.
Okay.
So it still is the overarching narrative, and it is the term that everybody runs for cover. They don't want to be called homophobic or transphobic, and they're afraid to even question the ridiculousness of that label. I mean, a phobia is an unreasoning fear. My opposition to homosexual practice doesn't have to do with any unreasoning fear.
No.
My opposition has to do with a very reasoned understanding of why it's wrong.
They would say
everyone should have a sort of natural revulsion to some extent for the behavior in question. This is something God-given, but it's simply a reinforcing factor to what people already ought to recognize based on reason. I mean, Paul, when he makes his appeal in Romans 1, is making an appeal to some extent based on reason, right? He's arguing that even if you don't have scripture in front of you telling you what to think about these questions, you ought nevertheless to be able to realize it just by looking at the natural world, by looking at the way the organization of masculinity, the organization of femininity, and be able to see, oh, well, there is a design there. Anatomically, physiologically, the capacity to procreate, and even psychologically, that in every way, shape, or form, the appropriate sexual counterpart to a man is a woman, and to a woman, a man. And it takes a lot of years of education to override the obvious sometimes, but that's an obvious that everyone ought to be able to intuit. Just as Paul said they ought to be able to intuit that there's something problematic about idolatry. There's something problematic about thinking that you can encapsulate the creator of the cosmos by images of humans or even worse, animals, and use that as a way to manipulate and restrain God. I mean, it's ridiculous. No, God stands above everything. God is the creator of all things. And through, Paul says, the material structures of creation, we can ascertain certain things about who God is and about what God wants for human life. And it's not meant to be anachronistic here, it's not meant to be rocket science or brain surgery. It's meant to be obvious. And it is indeed obvious. You have to actually, quote unquote, educate children to realize that, you know, a man being married to a man is as appropriate as a man being married to a woman. From relatively early age, children can realize, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. And they find it odd that a man and a man would be in such a relationship, or a female and female. So they have to be indoctrinated heavily to an opposite conclusion. And that automatically should tell us something. Really, the people who are afraid are the persons promoting this behavior, because they're the ones that are insisting on forcible indoctrination.
Yep.
Without which they would have no case.
Yep. And yeah, what you said is very important, because I was really criticized for both of my books for being too graphic, but I kind of felt like I had to be, because people weren't getting it. And just on a physiological level, they weren't getting it. So I thought like I had to say, okay, this doesn't work. And this is why it doesn't work. And these are the ramifications of it.
Oh, I thought that your work was so, when I first encountered your work, I thought, oh, this is, first of all, A, very well written, B, very powerful as a personal testimony, and precisely because of the graphic nature, because most people would say, oh, they don't do that, or this doesn't happen. And they just have no idea, because all they're operating out of is what they know from their own relationships. And they have no idea the differences that arise from the fact that when you have men having sexual intercourse with men, the extremes of male sexuality are not being moderated. No. And the gaps in male sexuality are not being filled. They're actually being exponentially increased, because you don't have an appropriate sexual counterpart for the union. So then, it's like things that men would never even think of proposing to women. Or the way, for example, that in some gay publications, men advertise for male sex partners. A man, if he ever tried to advertise himself that way for a female partner, they would get no interest whatsoever.
They'd pass.
Yeah, it's just, so men quickly, they have to learn, they have to be re-socialized into realizing if they want to have a relationship with a woman, there is a certain extent, they have to moderate the extremes of male sexuality, because it's not going to pass muster in feminine circles by and large. So that turns out to be one of the problems of homosexual behavior, both for men and for women. They have disproportionately high rates of measurable harm, and they have it in a way that differs from each other in their extremes, in ways that correspond to exactly what we would expect to happen to men if left to their own devices, without the moderating influence of a woman.
You know who made that point? For me, the first person was Randy Schultz, who wrote And the Band Played On, who was—
Oh, really?
Yes, who I shouldn't say I knew him, but
he acknowledged that.
Yeah, he did. He said, why, and he used that word, moderating. He said, why things went, I wish I had the quote right here, I don't have it, but people know it, it's in my book like 10 times. Why things went so out of control in the gay male community, let's say, he was talking about during the 1970s, was there was no moderating influence of women to say no. And that's what happened. And he said it. And when I read it, I was like, okay, that's it. That's okay. He got it. I got it. And
J. Michael Bailey, also professor of psychology at Northwestern, who did most of the identical twin studies back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And he acknowledged also that even though he's thoroughly supportive of homosexual unions and basically supportive of transgenderism, although there's an aspect of transgenderism, autogonophilic transsexuals that he has some issues with, but basically very supportive of the homosexual ideology and objectives. And yet he would say at one point in his book, he would say, homosexual males are always going to have many more times the number of sex partners over the course of life than any other group. And even when marital laws change in their favor, this is always going to be the case. Why is it going to be the case? Because men are men.
Yeah.
And even so, he has like one chapter on how homosexual males are more female-like than heterosexual males. But then his next chapter is about how homosexual males are still basically male in their sexual stimulation pattern. And so
very much
they
so.
just essentially agree with each other. This is what I would like to do. Is that okay with you? Yes, that's what I like to do too, right? Men are more visually stimulated. They're more genitally focused. They don't need to have a whole relational buildup necessarily in order to enjoy sex with one another and so forth. I'm creating a little bit of a stereotype, but relative to women, women sexual stimulation is a more holistic process, more multifactorial. And generally, for most women, you really need to have some knowledge of this person you have.
Yeah.
You know, one time, one person asked me, a friend of mine who was newly married, he said, you know, yesterday on my own initiative, I washed and waxed the floors for my wife. And he said, later that night, we had great sex.
That was foreplay.
Yeah, he said, exactly. He said, what gives? I don't get the connection. I said, well, it's not because Johnson floor wax is particularly erotically stimulating to them, but that expression of care and concern that you showed for your wife, unsolicited, she didn't even have to ask you to do it. It's like, wow, what a guy this is. And it created this sense of sexual desire for her just by virtue of his behavior that had, in his opinion, nothing to do with sex whatsoever. And because he added to me, well, she doesn't have to wash and wax the floor for me to be aroused, unless, of course, she was scantily clad while doing it. Then maybe I would be aroused. But so, yes, difference in patterns between male and female sexuality. And so the extremes of masculinity in terms of sexual expression are going to be ratcheted up in a union without a woman. And that's why you get this predictable, disproportionately high rate of measurable harm exhibited in a few key ways, like number of sex partners over the course of life, like incidence of sexually transmitted infections. I mean, these are just going to be over the top relative to any other group. And again, you know, people are like, gee, why is that? What a mystery. I wonder why that's so. Oh, give me a break. I mean, all you have to do is take your own masculine sexuality and ask what it would look like if you didn't have a woman moderating it for you.
Exactly. There was an important study done in San Francisco, of all places, and it showed that men who are so-called monogamously partnered the majority had open relationships.
Yeah,
so they had a primary relationship, and then they were also, there was negotiated circumstances where they could have sex outside the relationship. Also, post-Obergefell, I've looked at the numbers lately, but they've been all way below 20%. They've been like 12, 13, 14% of lesbians and gays are married. And they group them together. So I would argue that most of those are lesbians that are same-sex married. So gay men have not gotten married.
Yeah, it's not been the big panacea that people predicted, right? If we just give them gay marriage, this will re-socialize males to behave in the way that, as badly as they do, but still better, heterosexuals behave. And it just hasn't proven to be the case because most gay men find the traditional strictures on marriage oppressive.
Yeah.
It doesn't express who they are or who they want to be in relation to others.
No.
And it's just, so why bother, right?
Right, exactly. And now when I came
Or they'll, as you say, just simply redefine it with an open-ended marriage.
Exactly.
If they get married.
You're right. When I came out in the 80s, you had to go to a bar or a bathhouse or whatever to meet somebody. You know, now it's all much more sophisticated and online, things like Grindr. So, you know, people who are outside that space see like, oh, well, gay bars are closing and those sort of things are closing, you know. Oh, well, you know, it's changing. Well, no, it's just moved. It's just different. But it's still going on. Now,
Did you ever see, by the way, the movie American Beauty?
Yes, I did. Yes.
Remember how they presented the gay couple living next door? They're like the Ozzie and
Oh, yeah, I
Harriet
do remember that.
of gay couples. Their life is perfect, right? Well, the life of their heterosexual neighbors are just completely falling apart. This is Hollywood's mythical image. And it's not that there aren't, I mean, there certainly are some homosexual relationships, especially among women, where it doesn't exhibit some of these problems to quite the same degree. But it is not the norm. It's not the usual manifestation you're going to have. There are many problems in heterosexual relationships. That's what's created the way for acceptance of homosexual unions, a sort of guilt felt by heterosexuals. If I can give a pass to a homosexual relationship, then I get a pass for all my failures as a heterosexual. So there's a big part of that dynamic that's involved in doing that.
Yeah, people see the Ellen DeGeneres, the Anderson Cooper, the Elton John, even though their relationships have been complex, that's what they see, you know. Mm-hmm. And you could see it. I wrote my book before Obergefell because I kind of felt like there was a real whitewashing of the homosexual experience. And especially in that whole LGBT acronym, all that stuff had got pushed together. And I was very much like, you know, the lesbian experience has nothing to do with the gay male experience. And it was all, and that bothered me. But Americans have really kind of they've just kind of bought into it, and Christians too, as well. I mean, 80% of young Catholics support same-sex marriage. So it's just, yeah, they've bought into it. So,
and that shows that the church is not doing a good job teaching on the subject.
Oh, they don't teach it. They don't teach it at all.
At all, right?
You know, I mean, that's where I don't blame James Martin. I blame the institution in general, because James Martin filled a vacuum. Because I mean, I tried to speak on the subject. Maybe I wasn't as eloquent as other people, and I was, you know, I had a more, you know, it was a little more hardcore message. But they wouldn't let me speak. So somebody like James Martin comes along and he fills that vacuum. And he speaks, because I do go to his talks. I don't see a lot of gay people. I see a lot of parents with gay kids who are trying to figure out what to believe. And I want to say this too real quick. Most gay people don't care what the Bible teaches about homosexuality. They don't care about what Catholicism teaches. They don't care what the Baptist Church, the LDS Church. They just don't care. They've kind of moved on. If they were raised in any kind of organized religion, they tend to be spiritual instead of religious in terms, and I was that way too. I didn't care, but there's a small minority, for whatever reason, are attached, usually to the way they were raised, whether it was Catholic or Protestant or whatever. And they're trying to maneuver their way and trying to fuse or, you know, combine their identity, what they think is their identity, with a religious practice. And that's where people like James Martin are dangerous, because that group of people I'm concerned about, because I think they do deserve to hear the truth. The vast majority don't care. They don't care. But that small minority, I do want them to hear the truth. And I'm sure you do too.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people who are more or less orthodox in their other views, and they do want to hear if there is a position that makes sense of the biblical viewpoint, right? And if they don't get that, then they say, well, then I guess I do have to go over to the other side.
Yeah. And I have to say one other thing too, real quick. The thing that concerns me too, that I've seen in the Catholic Church, and I call it grooming. I don't care if people don't like that term, but I came out, I was 19 years old, which in '88 was pretty young. Still, guys were kind of coming out later, like in their 20s. Some people were coming out much later. Now we have children coming out, even as trans, prepubescent kids coming out. So the involvement of the parents and what the parents believe, if they're religious, in a religious context is much more important, because then it affects the child. So even if the child doesn't believe or care, that has a big influence. And what I'm seeing in Roman Catholicism is a very concerted effort to tell parents they need to accept, or your kid will commit suicide. They'll be suicidal, if you don't accept an LGBTQ identity. And then they lay out this whole framework of biblical, catechetical, just junk pile that says that it's okay. And here's the foundations for it. This is where I get scared.
No, we have to realize that
Gosh, I haven't
for
even
Jesus, the foundation of all sexual ethics is male and female, he made them. And for this reason, a man may become joined to a woman, and the two become one flesh.
Yeah.
Jesus highlighted those two texts in Genesis 1:27 and 2:24 as normative, with both prescriptive and proscriptive prohibition implications for all other forms of sexual behavior.
Okay.
That's the foundation. So we can't, as a church, expect that we can pull the rug out from under that foundation, to carry on the building metaphor, and expect that the whole structure is going to stay in place. It's not going to happen. In fact, every form of sexual immorality virtually can ultimately be traced to a lack of consistency with that foundation. Male and female, he made them. And for this reason, a man may become joined to a woman, and the two become one flesh. So we're not talking about a minor matter here. We're talking about a major matter within Christian ethics.
We're in a deep pit of darkness. And I realized it too, is that, first, when people accepted that, to be blunt, that an anus can be a vagina, that's a problem. But then you accept, I outreach in San Francisco at a lot of different fairs, and I had a very nice person, very sweet. I don't know whether to say he or she. This person was born male but identifies as female. And I was having a conversation with them, and I would say from the waist up, they look female. From the waist down, no, they were still a male. And I was like, I probably was a little too inquisitive, and I said, okay, how do you reconcile this? And they said that my penis is a very large clitoris. I was like, oh, okay. But then I had the same conversations with people who were transitioning a different way, and then saying, well, my clitoris is a vagina, but is a penis. And I was like, well, okay, we accepted that the anus is a vagina. Now we're accepting that the penis is a clitoris. So this is where we are. This is where we are.
Right. It's a complete divide from biological reality. And we're expected to say, well, that subjectively defined view of human sexuality, which has no basis in biological reality, is what is true, what is truest. And it's so absurd. You're ready to pull your hair out. How can people be this ridiculous, right?
But
we're moving in a frame of mind in our cultural context, and it's so utterly inconsistent because we don't do it for anything else, right? If a person wants to identify as Black, let's say they want to increase their odds of getting into a top school, and all the top schools are looking for, really making an effort to get, for example, Black students in who have top grades, top standardized scores, et cetera. It's like a feeding frenzy among the top schools to get that. So a white student looks at it and says, gee, you know what? I think I'll just identify as Black. I mean, that's who I am. That's who I culturally picture myself as, right? You'd be laughed out, like Rachel Dolezal was when she claimed to be Black, but she was a white person that went to a tanning salon. Yeah. That doesn't make you Black. And yet gender, specifically when sex is gender, is even a more basic biological reality than is race. But we accept a person being able to say they are whatever gender they claim they want to be, whatever sex they claim they want to be. It used to be that they would make a distinction, right, between sex and gender, and they would say, well, my sex may be male, but my gender is female. Now you're simply expected to say, to confess, okay, this biological male is a female, not just a trans woman, but an actual woman. We have to just say an actual woman. We can't qualify it in any sense. It's kind of absurdity, but we wouldn't accept it for any other category. We wouldn't accept that kind of subjectivity for race. We wouldn't accept it for age. You know, I think I'd like to retire early and get my Social Security benefits. So even though I'm 20, I want to identify as 65.
That's a good idea.
You know, nobody, are you insane? And people will look at you, what is your problem? But we can do it with the category of sex. And not only can we do it, we must do it. And if we don't accept that, then all sorts of penalties accrue to us within society.
Yeah.
And we become outcasts and should be ashamed of ourselves. But the thing is complete nonsense on its face.
I agree. My heart and compassion still goes to the people that I talk to, like on the front lines, because I know that I kind of regarded myself at that time as like a living experiment when I was doing what I was doing. Because the people, a lot of times, I call them the eggheads, the people that are spouting this sort of whatever queer theory or queer theology, a lot of times they are unaffected. And other people who actually listen to what they say and put it into practice in their body, they're the ones that have to suffer. So those are the people that I'm concerned about, and the people like the James Martins of the world, they're the ones essentially responsible for all of this.
And the greatest extremes now on every level are being felt, of course, in transgenderism. It's taking the problems that exist with homosexuality and they get ratcheted up even further with transgenderism in two really grave ways. One is that children are basically being set on a path because of the
hormone blockers
that they have to take, that in the end, it ends up being a fait accompli. And whereas, of course, as you know, they would normally identify, if you give it time, with their own sex, instead, because of those hormone blockers, they're placed on a path in which they can never get out. And in the end, what it requires is a butchery of functioning sex organs and rendering them completely sterile for the rest of their lives. So if they change their mind later, too late, because you've already gone through these processes. So that should be considered absolutely scandalous, absolutely scandalous. And then the other facet in which transgenderism really heightens the problem is on the question of civil liberties, and particularly as regards compelled speech, because you don't have quite the same problem when you're addressing somebody who identifies as gay or lesbian. You know, you can call them still by their name. You can use the pronouns that they actually do match their biology. But when you're talking about transgenderism, you're being required now in many circumstances, if you want to retain your job, and in some places like New York City, if you don't want to be fined, you actually have to go along with the charade. You are being compelled to actually call a man a woman and a woman a man. And then on top of all that is a third major problem that arises. And that is the danger that it puts young people in. So, for example, one story I just came across yesterday. It was, I can't even remember what state, maybe Washington, I can't remember for certain. But there was a science camp that was being held for young people. It might have been just for young girls. And the counselors for the camp, some of whom identified themselves as they and them individually, right. I guess still saw themselves more males, biological males who identified as females, are basically sleeping in the same building with the young girls. So we're creating this problem of endangerment. And then with regard to sports, as we well know, what we're seeing, for example, with this Ivy League athlete, the so-called Leah Thomas at Yale, taking awards away from biological women. And now he has, at least within certain college functions, Ivy League events and so forth, he now holds women's records.
Yeah.
But everybody looks at him with the broad shoulders, what a broad-shouldered female. No,
Yeah.
this is a guy that doesn't even hardly kick with his legs because he uses his upper body strength to crush all his competition. And yet then we're supposed to extol this. Isn't this wonderful? And in the meantime, women athletes are suffering in the process. So we get all these, everything gets ratcheted up even further with regard to transgenderism is the end of the road with regard to the issue of homosexuality. But it's not a half denial of one's sex or gender, it's a holistic denial of it.
I agree. You're connecting the dots, because I see a lot of like I don't know what they call them online themselves, like traditional liberals, because they don't have a problem with homosexuality, but they are having a big problem with transgender. I think the very bright woman who wrote the book, Abigail Schreier, I think is in that category, because I've heard some of her speeches and she doesn't have an issue with homosexuality at all. But when I listen to her speak, I'm kind of like, because she's saying, well, people who are transgender have these certain psychological conditions and this and that. And I go, Abigail, you could say the same thing about gay people.
Yeah, that's right. And so they end up with an inconsistent position at the end. There are certainly some significant differences, obviously, between homosexuality and transgenderism. Although in the case of one category of transgenders that have been developed, the category of the homosexual transgender, there's certainly very significant continuity there. But in the end of the day, philosophically, it's one road leading to the next road.
A lot of trauma in both instances. I don't know. Yes, homosexuality and transgenderism.
And what they have in common is ultimately some degree of denial about their biological realities, their gendered existence in their anatomy, physiology, and psychology. It's just with regard to homosexual practice, as we noted, that basically homosexual males and females are perceiving themselves as half their own sex. So there's a lack of gender identity completion in their own self-understanding. But in the case of transgenderism, it's a complete and total denial of their true sexual identity. But you can't then say, well, homosexuality is good, it's only a half denial, whereas transgenderism is bad, that's a whole denial. No, it's a transitional element there. We would never get to the point of supporting transgenderism if we didn't already accept the view that a person is only half their own sex.
Ding, 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 ding. That's it. Exactly. I didn't want to talk about this subject with you, but real quick, just to tell you how deeply this has gotten into Roman Catholicism. I went to one of the LA Recs, the Religious Education Congress. It's the biggest, most prestigious religious education Catholic in the United States. And they had a young, again, I'm not sure how to dress, very nice person, very articulate. She was born, I said it, oh well. This person was, I always try to be careful. This person was born biologically female, now identified as male. I'm not sure, they didn't say it, but I had assuming that they had had a mastectomy because they were very, very flat-chested. And that person essentially got up in front of all these parents and said, you need to embrace gender transition in your children at a young age, And then they had the mother, of course, of a child who was also transgender. And she said the same thing. You need to embrace this at a young age. And I was just like, holy, this is really bad, because this is taking place in a religious context. And they interweaved it with religion, that, Christ was accepting and you need to be loving and all of this stuff. And if you don't accept your child, they're going to commit suicide, and that's not a loving act. I'm going to get into this real quick. I haven't even gotten to the quotes. I want to present you the series of quotes from the Jesuit James Martin, because this is the stuff that's being spewed out because I go to all of these conferences, I listen to their online conferences, whatever. Let's start with your permission, Professor Gagnon, with let's go in chronological order with the Old Testament. Okay, here we go. James Martin. This was a tweet. The New Vatican Study Bible looks at, among other topics, Sodom, Genesis 19, and Gibeah, I hope I pronounced that right, Judges 19. In both cases, says the study, what is condemned is not a sexual transgression, but pride and aggression toward a stranger or strangers needing assistance. So I've gone to several of these talks. Sodom was not about sodomy. Even though the angels wanted to rape, or the people wanted to rape these angels, it was about inhospitality.
Yeah, it's even good scholars like Richard Hayes at Duke, a New Testament professor, who at least in the past had written some good work supporting the biblical position on these questions, had said with regard to Sodom, it's not at all about the issue of homosexual practice. Well, the problem is that these persons like Martin present this as an either or. It's not an either or with regard to inhospitality or homosexual behavior. It's a both and. Yes, there is inhospitality that's being depicted in the narrative, but it's not the kind of inhospitality that has to do with not putting out the correct dinnerware. The inhospitality is rather, these are strangers coming into a walled city, and there aren't really much in the way of hotels in antiquity in the ancient Near East. And so they're reliant on people to take them in. They come to the city gate. This is the place where they would then be, hopefully, if there are compassionate people in the town, inviting them into their homes, coming under the shelter of their roof for protection. Otherwise, they have to stay outside at night, sleep, and could be subjected to robbers and rapists. So that's an important part of hospitality. And that dynamic is there in the text, how you treat strangers. But the way in which they are manifesting their inhospitality is not just the rape. It's the rape in the form of emasculation. That is, treating their masculine identity as non-existent, as if they could be the sexual counterpart to a man. So it's not like Sodom is telling just one sin. There are multiple sins at Sodom. It's what I call a kitchen sink story. You throw everything in the kitchen sink, and it's more than one element that's involved. There's coercive sex involved, but that's bad enough. But then it's coercive sex in the process of being same-sex coercive sex, which emasculates and therefore dishonors the men. Now, if the male visitors had consented to their emasculation, then they would have been held culpable themselves. But since it's forced on them, the ones that are culpable are those who are attempting to do it to them. But I usually give as an analogy, because there actually is an analogy in Genesis 9 to this, in the story of Ham and Noah. It talks about Ham seeing the nakedness of his father. Well, seeing the nakedness in the Levitical prohibitions of Leviticus 18 and 20 is a euphemism for having sexual intercourse with. And in fact, when Noah wakes up, he asks, what was done to him, which is not what you would normally expect as a question about voyeurism. So when I talk about that text in my book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, I give a series of arguments to show that probably what is in view here is same-sex rape. Now, it doesn't necessarily presume that Ham was erotically attracted to his father. It was an effort at subjugating his father to himself, so that now he becomes the dominant member of the family. He's basically emasculated, dishonored, and humiliated his father by virtue of engaging in this act in relation to him. Now, what I would say to that, by the way, I'm not the first one to make this proposal. Already rabbis in the 3rd and 4th century were debating about this, with one option being, what did Ham do? And one option is he engaged in homosexual intercourse with his father. and with his father too. So it's also incest. It's incest, it's homosexual practice, and rape, all rolled up into one. Now let's take the incest dimension of that. Would anyone argue that the story is talking about incest in the context of rape, therefore it's not indicting incest, but only rape?
Of course not.
Nobody would argue that if they acknowledge, or even if they don't grant that this story involves sexual intercourse. And by the way, the greatest Old Testament scholar of the 19th century, Hermann Gunkel, and the greatest of the 20th century, Gerhard von Rad, both believed this story was about same-sex rape, same-sex incestuous rape. So I'm not exactly giving a novel proposal in that sense. But even if you don't buy that with this story, just take as an example, suppose a man rapes his mother and people are horrified. Oh my goodness, the man raped his mother. Do you think that the only thing that people are going to be horrified by is the rape part?
No.
Are they not also going to be horrified by the fact that this rape is manifested in the context of incest? Of course, it's going to be. Anytime somebody would tell a story like that in society, people would understand this not as a singular offense, but as a double offense. I mean, rape is bad enough as it is, but incestuous rape of your parent, that just ratchets up the degree of evil involved in the act. And that's exactly the way the Sodom story works in Genesis 19. It's intended as a story to communicate this unbelievable depth of evil. I fully grant there are other problems going on at Sodom. The narrative itself even presents that. When God talks with Abraham before going there, the cry has already gone out from Sodom about how bad Sodom is in a whole host of ways. And when you look at Ezekiel 16:49-50, which talks about the Sodom text, also more than one element is presented as a problem there. I have no problem with that. And I have no problem with arguing about inhospitality being an element of that picture. But that's not, you're not saying the whole thing when you're saying that. There's no question that in the ancient Near East, anyone hearing that story would have recognized that this is a multiple offense story.
Right.
There's nobody who would have thought, even in cultures that had some degree of acceptance of some forms of homosexual practice, would have recognized that in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, let alone, society in ancient Israel. And when you look at how Ezekiel presents it, and then some people also misread Ezekiel's interpretation of it, by the way, at the same time. But Ezekiel talks about, he talks about the pride and not taking care of the poor and the needy. And then he says, and they committed an abomination.
Right.
Toavah. Now, then some scholars will want to argue that, the abomination was the pride and not help the social injustice, not helping the poor and the needy. But the problem with that is when you look at 2 chapters later in Ezekiel, he gives a vice list in which he's trying to argue that if your parents did these things, no longer will the children be held, the sin won't pass on to the children. By the same token, if the parents are righteous and the children do these things, then the children will be held culpable for it. And in that list, he separates in the list not taking care of the poor and the needy from committing an abomination. It's like several vices in between those. So clearly he does not mean by committing an abomination, not taking care of the poor and the needy. It's a separate offense. And then he adds a few other singular offenses before he summarizes at the end and calls all the preceding things abomination, but only one previous element that he specifically tagged as an abomination. Now, when you couple that fact with the fact that we know, all scholars of Ezekiel know that Ezekiel used what we call the holiness code in Leviticus 17-26, because there's lots of verbatim similarity between material in Ezekiel and that document. We call it the holiness code because it stresses, be holy as I am holy, Yahweh says in its first few chapters, and really emphasizes the moral dimension and in particular the sexual dimension of it. And when you look at that, you see, that committed an abomination phrase that Ezekiel uses, in the Hebrew, that's identical to the phrase discussing man-male intercourse in Leviticus 20. And then you look further and say, so Ezekiel has this vice list. In the middle of that vice list, one is simply called committed an abomination, one among many vices in the vice list. And then in the summary statement, all the preceding vices are abominations. There's only one other place we find that, and that's in Leviticus 18 and 20, where only there's a sort of, actually Leviticus 18, because 20 doesn't have this summary statement. But in Leviticus 18, the text about sex laws, sex prohibitions, the summary statement at the end calls all the preceding sexual offenses abominations, plural, toravot. But in the listing of them, incest, adultery, bestiality, man-male intercourse, the only one that's specifically tagged an abomination singular, toravot, is homosexual practice, man-male intercourse. That's the exact same phenomenon that we have in Ezekiel. And since Ezekiel clearly knows that holiness code in Leviticus, apparently Ezekiel is reading the Sodom tradition in light of the prohibition of homosexual practice in Leviticus. And that means that he's understanding the same-sex intercourse per se to be a major element of the sin at Sodom. Because, by the way, the prohibition of homosexual practice in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 isn't about rape. And we know it's not about rape because when we go to Leviticus 20:13, where the penalties are given for the sexual offenses discussed in chapter 18 and reordered according to severity of offense,
Exactly.
it says their blood be upon them, which is a culpability formula saying they both consented to the act. Therefore, they can both be held responsible. So the kind of homosexual practice that's being rejected in Leviticus is not just an instance of rape, a particularly exploitative act of homosexual practice, but the totality of it is being rejected, in which both parties are consenting to the act. And Ezekiel is reading the text of Sodom in light of that prohibition in Leviticus, which is exactly how all future commentators read it as well. So there's no question that if you look at the story of Sodom in its ancient Near Eastern context, in its literary context within the Bible, there's no question that they're understanding the homosexual dimension of the act as one of the major problems that makes the offense at Sodom so great, in addition to the inhospitality and the rape. There are many other arguments I could draw on this. For example, also, for those who accept some notion of literary strands within the Pentateuch and talk about the Yahwist, for example, the J source in the material. Well, it's the same author of Genesis 2. And when you look at Genesis 2, it's quite clear that the author of Genesis 2 believes that the reason why a man may become joined to a woman and the two become one flesh is precisely because male and female emerged out of one flesh. I mean, that's the picture being presented at the very beginning, that God extracts from the, usually translated rib in your English translation, but it's a word everywhere else translated side. And I think that's the best translation here. Extracts from the side of the Adam, or the human, from which is formed woman. Up until this point, we just have a sexually nondescript person called an Adam. Now, it could be later defined as a male in retrospect, but it's hard to define male as male in absence of a woman. And the implication of the story is that something is extracted from this original human, which is just what Adam means. Adam means the one drawn from the Adamah, the ground. It's simply a description of the human being, period, without reference to particular sex. It only later becomes a proper name for Adam. So you have something extracted from that original human. Well, then that flesh is not completely whole, is it? From a sexual dimension, because there's now a missing element. And so when you look at Genesis 2:21 to 24, 4 times in the space of a few verses, it's emphasized that something has been removed, extracted from the original human. So in a sense, when man becomes joined to a woman in marriage, it's not just a union, it's a reunion of the constituent parts that were once part of an integrated sexual whole. So there's no question that for the author of those texts, the Yahwist, who is also the author of the text on Sodom, you're going to tell me that that author isn't going to have seen some problem with male-on-male intercourse if it were consensual? His whole basis for marriage is constructed on the basis of two sexes forming an integrated sexual whole. The reason why they become one flesh is because they originated from the same flesh. And by the way, this image, I'll say parenthetically, this image of an extraction from an original human creating two sexes, that's unique in the ancient Near East. We don't have anything else like that. And that's why in the ancient Israelite thought, this is absolutely bedrock. This idea that you have to have a male and female for any sexual union is absolutely bedrock. It's implanted right in the creation text, right from the very beginning. The first division of the humans is a division based on sex. And so it's a foundational element of human sexuality. Everything else follows from that. And it's not any different from the author usually attributed to what we call the priestly right, or P, in Genesis 1. Because Genesis 1 also talks about God creating us male and female in his image, in his likeness. And then some look at that and they say, oh, well, that's just simply saying that both males and females individually are made in God's image. Well, it is saying that, of course, but it's not saying just that. Because when you look at that expression, male and female, in its literary context, Hebrew, zakah, unakeva, not an expression. You might think it would appear all over the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't. It only appears in the first 7 or 8 chapters of Genesis. And outside of Genesis 1:27, it appears in Genesis 5, 1-2, introducing a genealogy. And then it appears in the Noah's Ark narratives. The animals went into the ark 2 by 2, male and female. So every single use of male and female that exists, including the one in Genesis 27, which is followed with a statement about being fruitful and multiply, by the way, clearly has in view a sexual pair. Not just male and female as isolated units, but male and female as a distinct sexual pair. And that's exactly how Jesus is using it. When he cites it in connection with the issue of divorce and remarriage in Mark 10, parallel in Matthew 19. I mean, just think about it. What is the moral logic of Jesus's position? What Jesus is going to argue in those texts, when he's asked a question about divorce, he's going to argue that remarriage after divorce, just like polygamy, violates a foundational two-ness of the sexual bond. Jesus is arguing that if you introduce a third party or more into the relationship, you have violated a foundational aspect of marriage. On what basis does he argue that?
Before you get to Christ, this is probably...
Okay, I am getting ahead of myself, but I guess what I'm trying to say is...
No, you're not.
That the whole web of scripture is tied together here at this point.
Exactly.
So when I look at the Sodom text, you know what I do? I show a slide. I just put up a visual. I show a slide. In the center is the circle Sodom. And then I have a series of concentric circles around that.
I remember that, yeah.
You know, what does the author, the Yahwist of these texts elsewhere presuppose about marriage? And then I look, what does the ancient Near Eastern view presuppose generally? Then I look at other texts within the Old Testament canon of scripture, including the parallel text to the Sodom text, which is the Levite at Gibeah, that appears in Judges 19, which is another parallel story and makes the exact same point. And then I look at the history of the interpretation of the Sodom narrative in early Judaism, in early Christianity. And at every level, when you look at all those concentric circles of evidence and just the general view about sexuality in the Bible, you can come to only one conclusion, that anybody hearing the story of Sodom in ancient Israel would have concluded multiple offenses.
Right.
And the key element of those offenses, the one that would have ratcheted up everything, is the man-male intercourse component, which dishonors or devalues one or both of the parties by treating their masculine stamp as only half intact.
Yeah.
You don't have the way that could be read in the ancient world. And I would defy, you know what I'd love to do here? This is like a dream I have, if I could share with you, Joseph, just privately between you and me. I would love to be in debate, a public debate with James Martin over these issues. I would love for him to pull these kinds of arguments with me present, because he wouldn't be able to then ignore what I've already written on the material.
He wouldn't debate you in a million years, because when I've gone to his talks, he won't even take questions, unfiltered questions from the audience. He won't do that. What you have to do is you have to write a question out, and then whoever, the moderator, whoever, they pick them out.
Right, screen them for him.
Exactly. It's ridiculous.
I generally don't do that in my presentations because I'm not afraid of what people are going to ask.
No. Yeah. Anyway, you don't have to answer that, but this is just when you were talking, these are some of the, because I always have the little devil's advocate in my head, or I always have a little queer theologian in my head talking. You know, they're always saying those Old Testament admonitions about homosexuality were primarily about pederasty or about slave master, non-consensual relationships. That's what I shouldn't say that's what they would say. That's what they do say.
So that's what they claim. And that particularly in the Greco-Roman milieu, the issues in the Greek realm primarily would be pederasty and prostitution.
Right.
And the issues in regard to the Roman realm would be primarily master-slave relationships and prostitution. So they would argue they're only dealing with particularly exploitative acts. Right. But the problem with that is manifold, namely that there's nothing in the biblical text that restricts or limits it to those developments. And in fact, it can't be, because again, right in the text of the Levitical prohibitions, their blood be upon them. They are both culpable. Now, if it were just somebody exploiting somebody who didn't want to be exploited, then that person would not be held culpable. The one who's being exploited, only the one doing the exploitation. That's very clear in the biblical text. So the text is framed in such a way that it's very inclusive. And they could have easily used terms that existed in the Semitic realm to restrict it. For example, they could have referred to a person who is being lain with, the more passive receptive partner in the act. They could have referred to as the Kadeshim, Kadeshah, Kadesh, which is a term, the so-called consecrated one. A shrine figure really is what they mean by it. People who are known in the ancient Near East to be associated with shrine, with cultic acts, who actively feminized themselves to attract male sex partners. They could have used that expression if that's what they meant. They didn't. They just used the term zakar, male. Yeah. And when the rabbis later looked at this in the first few centuries of the Common Era, looked at, for example, the Levitical prohibitions, they would ask, well, what is meant by man? And they said, oh, well, male is an inclusive term. Both an adult and a minor are meant. It's fully inclusive. So the person who is being lain with by a man can be either an adult or minor. Either way, it's an abomination, an abhorrent or detestable act before God. Yeah. And when Paul uses the expression arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians 6:9, anyone wants to look up 1 Corinthians 6:9, 1 Corinthians 6:9 to 10 is a vice or offender list. Persons that Paul says will not inherit the kingdom of God. And among them are the persons, the Greek term is arsenokoitai. Well, what does that mean? It is drawn from the Greek translation of the Levitical prohibitions, where the term for male in Greek is arson, and the term for lying or having sexual intercourse with is koite, or the related verb koimai. That's what's being reflected in the word arsenokoitai. Right. So literally, it does mean, despite the new recent ridiculous updated NRSV, which has now replaced that term with something like men who commit illicit acts. You know, what an absurdity. There's no question that when you break down the word, it can only mean one thing. Men from the suffix, the case suffix, which is masculine, who lie, i.e. have sexual intercourse with. We're not talking about prevaricating here. We're talking about the kind of lie, sleeping, having sexual intercourse with. From the koi, and the arson is the object. The prefix is, these kinds of constructions in Greek is normally the object of the verbal idea inherent in the second part of the compound. So it has to be translated lying with a male. Literally, that word means men lying with a male. Now, how many interpretations can be given to that? Not a whole lot. It's pretty descriptive, right, of what you're talking about here. You have to have men, you have to have a male, and what's happening in between that is sexual intercourse between the two. That is the only way it can be interpreted. Now, the fact that Paul is using a term that is specifically extrapolated from the Greek translation of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse indicates that what Paul means by it is an act as inclusive as being rejected in the Levitical prohibitions, which means completely inclusive. It's an absolute prohibition, no exceptions. All people who fit the categories of men lying with a male, whether that male be an adult or a minor, fall under the rubric of this condemnation. And when you look at, when you ask, for example, in the ancient world, say in the first century in Judaism, what their view was on this question about the law, what was the law's view about homosexual practice? You can look at the two key first century Jewish writers, a philosopher in Alexandria named Philo, and an historian from Palestine named Josephus. And both of them, when they look at the Sodom text, identify as the main sin at Sodom the issue of homosexual practice.
Did they know that Jonathan and David were lovers?
Yeah, they didn't get that clue. Somebody didn't send them the memo on that. So they didn't really realize that. I mean, yeah, what an absurdity. And that I have a whole section on in my first book too. About David and Jonathan. What David and Jonathan is all about, it's not at all a sexual relationship. What David and Jonathan, but it is a covenant relationship. And it's a key covenant relationship because, of course, at this time, Saul is king. And Jonathan is the heir apparent to the king. The only way David could become a king in that configuration is if he gets into the family line of Saul.
Exactly.
And as an older person to Jonathan, effectively, in a covenant relationship, he would function as Jonathan's older brother. And therefore, he would be next in line. And that's okay with Jonathan, because that's how they treat one another as brothers. And all the descriptions that are used in connection with David and Jonathan, you can find in the Hebrew text used of family relationships, where there's not at all an erotic component to it. This is about dynastic succession and covenant in that sense. Covenant is effectively kinship. It's the establishment of kinship across bloodlines with all its privileges and obligations. And so David is becoming a kin of Jonathan, not a romantic, erotic lover, but a lover in the neutral family sense, the obligation of kinship love that comes with being a family member. So in a sense, he's being adopted into the line of Saul with Jonathan's consent. It has absolutely nothing to do with eroticism. And anyone who's ever looked, for example, at ancient Near Eastern treaties, which is covenant on an international landscape, will see that the same kind of love language that you find with regard to David and Jonathan are used between the suzerain and the vassal with whom the treaty is being made, the overlord and the vassal. And there's nothing erotic about it at all. It's the extension of kinship across bloodlines, which makes you a fellow family member and therefore bound by family love to one another. Not at all erotic, and anybody who knows anything about the ancient Near East would know that.
uncomfortably intimate language survived into the modern age. Because I remember when one of the topics I was working on when I was doing my master's was Jack London, and he was about the most masculine man of the
Jack London.
early 20th century. But he had a male friend who was a poet, and I mean, Jack London never had homosexual relationships. They both always had, George Sterling and Jack London both had just relationships with women. But the language that they used in their letters back and forth, to the modern ear, sounds a little odd, about how much I miss you and let's get you talk. And I remember people in the class thinking, "Oh, it's homosexual, it's homoerotic." I'm like, come on here, people. The modern ear, especially American. I mean, even to me, coming from an Italian background, men will sometimes kiss each other on the cheeks. It doesn't mean they're gay.
Right, exactly. It's unfortunate that we've created a cultural stereotype which does not allow intimate expressions between persons of the same sex that have nothing to do with eroticism, but just that this is a kindred spirit. And I think of the expression in Anne of Green Gables, which I used to watch all the time with my girls when they were younger.
Oh, it's great.
I love to watch them watch that. I just get a kick out of it.
She had a very intense same-sex relationship with her friend in there, Diana.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Going on there. And there's no problem with that. I mean, I have a dear friend from college days, like more than a brother to me. And we still keep in touch decades and decades after those days. He was my best man at my wedding. And we talk to each other on the phone very frequently, say, "I love you, brother." And there's nothing erotic about it, but there is deep intimacy. There is deep masculine intimacy. But I don't get from him the masculinity that I perceive I'm lacking in myself.
No.
It's a deep masculine, intimate fellowship, but it's not a homoerotic relationship.
These
I don't feel any embarrassment over that at all.
These sort of relationships are tolerated, I think, among women, but not men.
That's right, because men do have just naturally, often more so than women, a fear of intimacy.
Yeah.
But then when you add to that they're afraid that if they're intimate with another man, it will come off as homoerotic. Then it's like, you ever seen sometimes men, particularly who haven't been in church, they try to hug each other. It's like, oh my goodness, it looks so awkward.
Quick.
I don't even want to see it. It's like keeping a person at an arm's distance. Like if you get too close, you're going to catch something. I don't know. It's just really ridiculous. We shouldn't have that kind of fear. In fact, that kind of situation culturally, to some degree, contributes to homosexual development.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, because men need this. They need this intimate affirmation from members of their own sex. And when that's deprived of them at a critical formation in their adolescent development or earlier, it can have long-term consequences. So anyway.
No, you're right. In my writing, one of the things I've been really interested in is apprenticeship in the trades, especially in medieval times. And in the arts, I've always been interested in that. And Mike Rowe, the guy from Dirty Jobs, has really tried to resurrect the idea of apprenticeship and working, and that's been lost in the modern age. And that was a way that men did relate to each other in a work environment that really fostered a closeness and a camaraderie that we don't have. I think the only place that men see this nowadays, and I think that's why they're obsessed with it, is sports. You have that camaraderie, or in the military, you would have that. Well, a lot of guys I knew that had lousy fathers, joined the military because they were longing for that camaraderie, but also that male mentorship that they didn't get. So
exactly,
that's another problem. This is probably the quote from Martin that I see regurgitated the most often. And he's speaking about homosexuality. He says, in his is our Lord Jesus Christ. In his long history, his 3-year public ministry, Jesus says nothing about the topic.
It's so laughable. I'm sorry, it's at once tragic and laughable.
But that's the one he throws out there as like, you know, the trophy. This is
Yeah,
my
that's
party.
right. And how many times did Jesus speak about incest?
None.
0.
Or
How many
pornography.
times did he remind his disciples, don't have sex with your parents,
Yeah.
don't have sex with your children, don't have sex with your siblings? 0. Does that mean that Jesus held some secret acceptance for incest? It's absurd. You can't gauge. This is a very important hermeneutical method. By hermeneutics, we mean the interpretation and application of scripture for new context. It's a very important hermeneutical method to recognize, or hermeneutical principle to recognize, that you cannot determine the significance of something by frequency of mention. And this is especially true when it comes to sexual ethics. How many times has a person gone to church and heard the priest or pastor give an entire sermon about why you shouldn't have sex with your mother? 0. Or any 0. I mean, they probably have never even been to a service where incest was even mentioned at any point, let alone it be the subject of a whole sermon. Now, should we deduce from that all these priests and ministers have some secret acceptance for incest?
Yeah, we should.
Or should we? By Martin's reasoning, that's what we should conclude.
Exactly.
But it's completely absurd. The reason why incest is not being mentioned is because the very mention of it is scandalous. If you have to have a message about why you shouldn't be committing incest, well, Houston, we've got a problem already. So that's even the very hearing of it is scandalous to the ear. Oh my goodness, cover the ears of your children, right?
And the Hebrews that Christ was talking to would have known this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everyone would have. There's just simply it's just so ridiculous. I mean, I got to say, if I were debating him, he gave the argument and say, really? You got to be kidding me. This is your argument? I mean, because it is so utterly absurd.
This is the best and the brightest the Catholic Church has to offer,
The reason why Jesus doesn't have to talk about it is so patently obvious. It's because there is nobody who is advocating for the position, let alone engaging in it, right? You've got an unbelievably clear witness to it in the Old Testament scriptures, which are their only scriptures, right? And you mean you got to have something else be said? Nobody's advocating for it, much less doing it. What is the point of harping on what is at any rate a scandalous thing to talk about? Because it is so offensive, because it is so beyond the pale of anything that could be considered acceptable. There's no point to mention it unless it's a problem. That's why you don't get it mentioned until Paul, because Paul now is the apostle to the Gentiles, and he can no longer presume the kind of sexual ethic that could be presumed in Palestinian Judaism. So now he does have to speak about the issue, but it's an extreme issue for even him to deal with, because when you look at the scriptural view on the subject, you find, I'm sorry to unnerve anybody here, but sin isn't all equal.
Yeah.
There are different levels of sin, and that applies also to sexual ethics. Not all sin is equal. So somebody could talk to me, well, we could say the sin of remarriage after divorce, when there's been inadequate grounds for any divorce. That's a sin. But which is worse, that or polygamy? I don't see the church accepting any polygamy yet.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that? Well, because everyone recognizes polygamy is worse. And what's worse than polygamy? Adultery and incest. Incest is worse than adultery. Who does not know this? Who does not know this, right? Fornication is bad. You shouldn't be having sex outside of marriage. But are you really going to compare that to sleeping with your parents? I don't think so. People know that incest is at a very high level of wrong. It's one of those irreducible minimums. And what's even worse than incest as regards consensual relationships? Not talking about intergenerational incest, but incest between consenting adults. Homosexual practice is regarded as worse in Scripture.
Okay.
Why? Because it's a violation of the very foundation of sexual ethics. Trying to derive a prohibition of all incest from the original first two humans, pretty difficult to derive because you got to start with somewhere, right? It's only with the passage of time where you develop beyond, there are more people, that you can prescribe certain relationships within certain circles. But right from the get-go, the first differentiation, sexually speaking, is on basis of sex, not on the basis of kinship, but on the basis of sex. And here's another element how you could discern what's most severe. Look at whether there were any loopholes allowed in biblical law for such things. And if there were, when were the loopholes closed off? The earlier the loopholes are closed off, the greater indication of the severity of the offense. Now, look at the number of partners in a sexual union. When was the loophole for polygamy for men closed off? Not in the Old Covenant, not until Jesus in the Christian movement did it get closed off. Well, when did the incest loopholes get closed off? Some of the patriarchs engaged in behavior that was subsequently closed off by the law of Moses. That loophole was closed very early. Now, some forms of incest were always wrong, but some other forms not always wrong. When did the loophole for homosexual practice get closed off? Never, because there was never any loophole.
Yeah.
Right from the beginning of creation, there's never any loophole in biblical law. Every piece of law, every narrative, every piece of poetry, every exhortation, every proverb, every metaphor that had anything to do with sexual ethics in the Hebrew Bibles always, without exception, presupposes a male-female requirement.
Yep.
That means homosexual practice is worse than incest, because there never was a loophole, and it's established right from the very get-go of creation. And it's actually the principles of the prohibition of homosexual practice that established the rejection of both incest and polygamy. It's not accidental that Jesus appealed to the two primary heterosexual texts of creation, Genesis 1:27 and 2:24, in order to establish, hey, this is the reason why I'm going to limit now the number of partners in a sexual union, whether concurrently, no polygamy, or serially, no revolving door of divorce and remarriage for any cause. I'm going to base that on a male-female requirement for marriage. Two primary sexes, male and female. The binary, the sexual binary at the beginning, is the basis, Jesus said, for limiting the number of partners in a sexual union to two.
Yep.
That's the foundation for everything.
Yep.
That means the violation of that foundation is not only, it's not like some people make a slippery slope argument. If we accept homosexual practice as culture has done, then we're going to have to accept polygamy, we're going to have to accept incest, consensual adult sort, and so on down the line. Well, in a way, that's true, except it gets the direction wrong. It's not like we're getting worse. The worst thing already happened, which was the acceptance of homosexual practice. Now we simply have to do a mopping up operation and go back and be more internally, logically consistent. If there's no two-sex requirement for sexual ethics, there's no logical, creation-based or nature-based argument for limiting the number of partners in a sexual union to two. Why did Jesus even say male and female, he made them? What has that possibly got to do with the issue of divorce and remarriage? The only thing it has to do with is establishing the reason why Jesus is limiting the number of partners in a sexual union to two.
Yeah.
And it's predicated on the two-ness, the duality, or binary character of human sexuality. Okay. And what homosexual practice says from the get-go is that doesn't matter. Exactly. Sexual differentiation, the sexual binary doesn't matter for mate selection.
Right.
But then you pull the rug out from the limitation of two persons to a sexual union.
They say,
and therefore you can now open it up to polygamy.
Yeah.
And look at incest. Why is incest wrong? Go to a cocktail party someday and throw out the question, why shouldn't you sleep with your mother? I'm sure you'll stop conversation immediately. I've never
Ugh.
tried it myself, but I'm only guessing.
I don't want to.
Now, the reason why is because it's sex between kinship sames. Too much identity on the part of the participants in the sexual bond based on kinship.
Right. I want to show you some tweets here from Martin. Hopefully this is, can you see these, Professor Gagnon?
Yes, I can.
Okay. This gets to I would say the crux of his argument. Okay. This was from 2010. There was a famous letter sent to Dr. Laura Schlesinger about Leviticus. This is what he's referring to here. For more Bible verses not to take too literally, see this. And that's the Dr. Laura letter. Interesting. Where the Bible mentions same-sex sexual behavior at all, it clearly condemns it. I freely grant that. The issue is precisely whether the biblical judgment is correct. The Bible sanctions slavery as well, and nowhere attacked it as unjust. Okay, let me read you just a couple of other quotes. Let me stop that share.
By the way, the problem there in that argument is dishonest analogical reasoning.
Yeah. He said,
what he's doing, he's making an analogy with some things in the Bible that we don't continue to accept. Therefore, we shouldn't accept this. But if you're going to argue honestly with analogical reasoning, giving analogies and comparisons, if you eschew proximate analogies, near analogies and favor instead distant analogies, then you're not arguing honestly.
No.
What you have to look for is what are the closest analogs to the Bible's prohibition of homosexual practice. And the closest analogs, analogies that have the most points of substantive correspondence with the thing being compared, are other acts of sexual immorality that we still embrace as such today.
Of course.
Particularly incest, because incest is a form of human sexuality that can be conducted with consenting adults in a committed union, but is still wrong because there's too much excessive sameness on the part of the participants in their formal structural categories. In the case of incest, too much sameness on the level of kinship. In the case of homosexual practice, too much sameness on the level of sex or gender. That is by far a closer analogy than slavery. The Bible has no vested interest in preserving the institution of slavery. Slavery is simply a last gasp attempt to rescue somebody from starvation in a society that has an inadequate social welfare net. You lose your job, you lose all ability to earn a living in a society, you can draw on welfare. There is no welfare you can draw on in the ancient world. So your recourse is starvation. And the only thing preventing that from happening in your situation, for example, in the most common occurrence of slavery in ancient Israel, would be debt slavery. So you can't pay your debts. What are you going to do? The last thing you have to sell is yourself. But Israel is clear with regard to fellow Hebrews, you're not to treat them, according to Leviticus 25, as slaves. You're to treat them as hired help. And when you look in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, there are laws about mandatory release dates after 6 years. It's not a permanent condition of life, and it's not a race-based institution in ancient Israel. So clearly there is movement in the direction. It's not something they endorse or love having because they place various strictures on it. They even require you not to return runaway slaves. So what kind of vested interest is there in Scripture on the condition of slavery? Very little. And Paul, when he's writing to Philemon, and Onesimus is Philemon's slave, Paul is trying to convince now Philemon to receive Onesimus back, but no longer as a slave, but rather as a beloved brother, because treating him as a slave would be inconsistent with the perspective that he is a Christian brother, a family member, and you don't enslave a family member. So clearly, there's no great love for slavery as an institution. It's at the best, it's simply an institution that's another option besides starvation in a society without a welfare net. But the issue about a male-female requirement for sexual ethics, that's grounded right in creation. And it's appealed to by none other than our Lord himself.
Of course.
And Paul himself can say that even pagans ought to know this, just based on the material structures of the human creation made by God. Look at a man, look at a woman, and tell me that those are not sexual beings designed for each other, anatomically, physiologically, psychologically. Of course, even a pagan, Paul says, should know this. How much more a believer or a fellow Jew should know this with direct revelation from Scripture. So it's not a position that the writers of Scriptures hold their nose about and say, gee, too bad we have to go with this thing. In fact, they hold the position against prevailing trends that exist elsewhere in the ancient Near East and in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean basin. In other words, if you were arguing the kind of position that Martin argues, you'd have to argue that Christianity would be quicker to adopt some acceptance of homosexual relationships than all other cultures in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world. Instead, it's the exact opposite. The culture most strongly opposed to homosexual practice of any sort. Any scholar worth his salt at all would know this, and even those not worth their salt should know this. Namely, is ancient Israel, early Judaism, and early Christianity.
Right.
So they're not just merely naively imbibing at the cultural well and not thinking about the position that they're adopting. They're actually holding a position against prevailing trends everywhere else in the world that they lived in. And they're actually building on it. That's what Jesus is doing. He's building views about sexual ethics, closing remaining loopholes, now about number, based on a male-female requirement for human sexuality. So it's not only regarded as, oh, it's one of the things we believe, it's regarded as foundational from creation on. So this is why I'm saying that somebody like Martin, I don't know how to, I'm trying to be charitable here, Joseph. So tell me which is the more charitable interpretation about what James Martin is doing. Is he either A, just grossly ignorant, or B, is he trying to deceive people? I'd go with whichever interpretation is more charitable here. But those are the only two options, because anybody who knows anything about reading Scripture in its historical context, or even knows anything about logic and analogical reasoning, would have to know that what he is doing is wrong. For example, why doesn't he say, for example, oh, well, we don't really, slavery, we got rid of that. So let's get rid of the concept of monogamy. Let's have polygamy now. I mean, maybe he's going to do that at some point. He certainly is headed in that direction. But so far, I don't think he does that. Why doesn't he make that analogy?
Yeah.
Because he would then have to say, well, I don't make that analogy because there are a few correspondences between those two things. Well, that's exactly the case with the issue of homosexual practice. So it's a really desperate argument in his part to prefer an analogy that's distant to an analogy that's proximate or near.
I think it's a combination of ignorance, maliciousness, and brainwashing. Just from Catholicism, because I've talked to so many Catholics, and they're very ignorant, especially on Scripture. The Catholics just don't read the Bible.
Yeah, Martin is different. Yeah. Martin should be an educated man. He's a priest. He should have knowledge of the biblical text.
I know he's a Jesuit, but I've kind of, just from my experience from Berkeley, I don't know what they study. It's all fill-in-the-blank studies. It's just a lot of gender, a lot of queer, a lot of feminist, all that stuff, environmental theology, you name it. I think they are ignorant. I think they are malicious because I think they have a very personal motive to all this. And I think they've just been brainwashed because the Jesuits are a predominantly gay male organization. So this sort of thinking just circulates and percolates.
Yeah, he's probably not in an environment that invites critical reflection.
Oh, not at all.
On those kinds of presuppositions.
Well, and I've been around these people too, that are influenced by these people, and it's bad. Here's another.
It's exacerbated by the fact that I and others have already talked about this and shown why slavery, for example, is a bad analogy. And so, is he not literate? Can he not read?
No, but they keep saying it.
Right, they still say it anyways, if nobody's ever responded to it and critiqued it and destroyed the argument.
No, they need to be deprogrammed, not just educated, deprogrammed. It's a cult mentality. Here's some more words of wisdom, and we're getting down to the end. These Bible passages that people throw at you, I think really need to be understood in their historical context. I mean, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and even the stuff from the New Testament where Paul talks about it once or twice, has to be understood in their historical context. Certainly in Old Testament times, they didn't understand the phenomena of homosexuality and bisexuality as we do today. So toss it.
Yeah, I know. That's what I call the new knowledge argument. We know things that they didn't know. And if they only knew what we knew, it's a very condescending approach, by the way. If they only knew what we know, they would change their mind, because I've changed my mind. I would do that. Well, that presumes, for example, that they didn't know things like the existence of committed same-sex relationships in the ancient world. Mm. One of the things that I've shown with my work is that, oh, yes, they did. In fact, they even had semi-official marriages between men, and in some cases, even between women in major urban centers like Rome, like Alexandria. They knew about such things, and yet church fathers and rabbis commenting on those marriages still call them against nature. Even though clearly as marriages, they're designed to show long-term commitment to one another, yet still, they're still against nature. That's like saying that if a man marries his mother, then that makes it okay because they've made it a long-term commitment. Mm. To which Paul would simply say, no, you're simply regularizing the sin. I wanted to stop yesterday, and you're making it a permanent situation. It would be the same thing that Paul would say about homosexual practice. What Paul says about incest between adults, for example, in 1 Corinthians 5, the case of a man and his stepmother, he would say the same thing about two adults of the same sex involved in a sexual union, marriage, semi-official marriage, or otherwise. Because regularizing the sin doesn't improve the sin. Yeah. The problem with homosexual practice is not its promiscuity, as that's a symptom of the root harm. But the root harm is beyond that. It's the dishonoring that comes by treating your gendered body as only half intact in relation to somebody of the same sex. Whereas God has made you wholly man or wholly female, not half male and half female, requiring an integration with a person of the same sex. So one half male and another half male make a whole male. That's not the way it works. It's rather a whole male and a whole female bring together the totality of the sexual spectrum into an integrated sexual whole. That's the way the logic of Scripture works. So they did know about committed relationships in the ancient world, and ancient Jews and Christians still rejected such relationships. What about the issue of causation factors for homosexual development? Lots of theories in the Greco-Roman world held by philosophers and physicians positing some degree of congenital influence on at least some forms of homosexual development. Yet it doesn't cause them to then accept the behavior in question. And the reason for that is obvious. The fact that something is innate doesn't make it moral. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how a Catholic priest could not know this. I mean, Catholics are supposed to know about original sin, aren't they?
No, they don't.
I mean, well, it's amazing to me. I mean, I grew up Catholic and I knew that as a boy.
Yeah.
And now a priest who's in the Vatican doesn't know this? It's really outrageous. But if you want to say that something innate makes it acceptable, then you completely undermine Paul's concept of sin.
It's not
innate.
innate.
Look at Romans 7, sin is an innate impulse, passed on by an ancestor, running through the members of the human body and never entirely within human control. This doesn't mean sin is acceptable. That's why Jesus and Paul use metaphors about dying for discipleship. because it's not simply a little correction here and there in your life. It's a total home makeover that's being required from within, right? From within. Jesus says it's not that so much the food that you ingest that defiles you, as it is the gratification of innate desires to do what God expressly forbids. That's what's body defiling.
Right. This is the club. Now we're at the club that he uses in his lectures and talks, because I argue that homosexuality is not an innate characteristic. I believe it's psychological, usually trauma based. He says God made, speaking to homosexuals, this is what I feel. This is what drove me out of Roman Catholicism, because it's not a peculiar opinion, because actually Pope Francis himself said it to some pre-sex abuse survivors. He said that, God made you this way. He made you gay. Martin said, God made you this way. You are wonderfully made, just like Psalm 139 says. You were knit together in your mother's womb this way. It's a mystery why you were made this way, but this is part of your identity. And another quote, being gay isn't a sin. It's the way that God made some people. Be careful about biblical literalism, e.g., should we stone people who work on the Sabbath? Exodus 35, 2. Also be careful, the Bible says a lot about marriage. Solomon, Moses, and Abraham all had multiple wives. So his argument is that God made certain people gay. When I was in the gay community, I had never actually heard that spin on it. I had heard a lot that people are just born gay, just naturally born gay. But Martin takes it a step further and says that God made you gay. I think
that's a different step. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's really.
Yeah, how you can move? How does he know that you can move from an innate characteristic, if we even start with that assumption, to the fact that God has put that innate characteristic deliberately there, and the gratification of it could be something that pleases God? How does he even know that? Because most innate desires are for things that God doesn't want us to do. I mean, I didn't ask to experience pride. No. I didn't ask to experience greed. I didn't ask to experience jealousy. I didn't ask to experience insecurity and fear. Okay, these are all basic innate impulses that you get from birth. That's the nature of sin, transmitted from one human being to another. I mean, my wife and I thought, we might have perfect children here. We really have great children. I mean, I'll be the first to brag about my children. But even I eventually had to realize, yes, of course, you can't have two parents who have innate sin in them and not transmit that to their children. It's going to happen. And even they are not perfect, and no human being is. So most of what involves the innate impulses of human life are things that we have to put to death and die to. So innateness has absolutely nothing to do with morality, because most of what's innate in us is oriented towards evil, is oriented towards self-interest, and not toward other interests and doing the will of God. That's why when Jesus defines discipleship, he defines it radically in the middle of Mark 8. You want to be my follower, you have to take up your cross, lose your life, and deny yourself. Then come follow me. Right? Well, that's a complete denial of oneself. He's using the metaphor of self-crucifixion, death. If our innate impulses are an indication of what God made us to be, why would we have to die to them? Doesn't make any sense. Jesus didn't certainly hold the view that he did. He referred to his own generation as this perverse and adulterous generation. Jesus was not somebody who had a high view of humanity's potential. He actually had a view of the humanity steeped in sin, and therefore needed to die to self, crucify themselves, deny themselves. Absolutely absurd from him to argue from any other perspective. I have just about all males I have polyamorous urges. That is, I'm not attracted to only one woman for the entirety of my life. I mean, I'd like to hook up to a lie detector. Any man who would say that he's only ever experienced sexual attraction for one person in the whole of his life. Because if there is any man who claims that, they're a liar.
He would argue that those things are bad, those things you mentioned.
But that's an innate impulse.
But he argues that—
Why doesn't he say God made them that way? Made men that way.
He argues that homosexuality is a gift from God, and that it is not. It's morally inert, just like heterosexuality is. You know, it can be taken into a destructive path or a giving, loving, and productive path. So
well, then I'd have to say that polyamorous orientations are also not intrinsically wrong. There must be some good polyamory, multiple partner unions, and some bad polyamory. Does he hold that view?
Publicly, no, I would say no.
Hopefully he doesn't hold that view. We can only hope, right? You know, only hope that that's not his view. But that would be an analogous perspective applied to the number of partners. That's a certain directedness or orientation. What about pedophilia? Does he think there's some good pedophilia? That pedophilia is not intrinsically bad? Hopefully not. Hopefully he doesn't think that. But that's what he's arguing. He's basically arguing from two perspectives. He's arguing which dovetail with one another. He's arguing that innateness is an indication that God made you that way.
Right.
Right? And
Correct.
He's arguing on an assumption that an innate impulse also has to have an intrinsically neutral component to it.
Correct.
And yet I've just drawn up a couple of analogies where that isn't the case. And you can just talk about so many innate desires. Again, when Jesus says it's not what you eat that defiles you so much as the gratification of inner desires to do things that God has forbidden. And then he ticks off a whole list of them, which all correlate with innate impulses. And yet all of them are wrong. Now, if homosexual practice were a good thing, then why would there be commands against it? Not only in the Old Testament, by the way, but in the New Testament, and also look at the direction Jesus is going. So you just cited from him one example was polygamy. They used to practice polygamy. We don't accept that anymore. Okay, I fully agree that we've changed from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant in many ways. But I want to ask a person like Martin, what direction does the change go in when it comes to sexual ethics? And what I see is Jesus not expanding the options for sexual expression, but rather further limiting them. So no more will it be allowed for men to have more than one sex partner concurrently, or to unilaterally divorce his wife and remarry. Not for my disciples, Jesus said. The strict monogamy principle that women were always bound by, I'm now going to apply to men as well. And I'm going to do that predicated on a male-female foundation, a male-female requirement for marriage. So the direction Jesus is moving in is not toward expanding possibilities for sexual expression, but rather moving to limiting them precisely by a male-female foundation, which Martin is rejecting.
He can't even make the innate argument because the science. If you go to the APA website, they have it right there. With sexual orientation, they said we have not determined what the cause of sexual orientation is. There's no one determinant, they say.
Yeah.
So he cannot even make the innate argument. You can't make it.
Yeah, I don't hold the deterministic view about homosexuality that he does. I also think that there are probably some congenital influences on homosexual development. They may be largely indirect, but they create greater or less likelihood of homosexual self-identification, homosexual orientation, as an individual negotiates in a culture between parental relationships, peer relationships, and incremental choices that they make in their life faced with certain situations, which either expand the range of possibilities or contract them in their life. But even if we granted, this is my key point, even if we granted Martin's assumption about it being totally innate, totally congenitally based, which the science does not demonstrate. But even if we did grant it, theologically, it's still irrelevant to the assessment of the innate impulse as moral or immoral, because most innate impulses are immoral.
Right.
So you'd have to say the assumption I'm going to make is, okay, you said it's an innate impulse. The odds are is that it's immoral.
Yeah.
Now you prove to me that it's otherwise, and you can't prove it from Scripture. It'd be like proving that incest is not immoral if it's conducted in the context of commitment and longevity and love. And I don't think Martin would do that. I don't think Martin would say it's okay to have sex with your mother if you institutionalize that in the context of a marriage bond.
Yeah.
Because he'd say that doesn't correct what's wrong with incest. And neither does marriage, neither does love or commitment correct what is wrong with homosexuality.
What he and other queer theologians won't explore, which is what I've tried to do, is that it seems like the two main determinants for male homosexuality is an absent, disinterested or abusive father, and same-sex molestation. 47% of gay men were molested. That's huge. That's a huge number. It's less than.
I would also put
it's less
relationship
than 10.
with same-sex peers in there as a very big factor as well.
It's less than that. That number is less than 10% in straight men. So it isn't innate. I don't know how he can make the argument. And it's just what scares me about it, just to kind of wind things up a little bit, I guess. What scares me about it is that they're saying it to young people, because I've gone to all of these conferences and all of these lectures, all these discussions, Zoom meetings, and it's directed mainly at young people that you're born that way. So parents, when you see a child expressing same-sex attraction, maybe gender, I don't know what you would call it, not traditionally male behavior, female behavior, they're transgender. It's really sick. It's really sick. There's like it's like a moral pressure to do that, a societal pressure to accept it, but it's also religious. It's like, this is the way God made this child, and you going against that, you're against God.
Yeah, that's right. And
that's pressure.
Basically what Martin is advocating at that point is blasphemous, because it's attributing to God, the creator, what God is not attributed to himself, but in fact, the exact opposite. And so he's trying to create a God in his image, rather than he being made in God's image. And that's what the work of Jesus is all about. God is trying to conform us into the image of his Son, which is the image of God. And that image does not promote the things that he is talking about. And we know that from Jesus himself. Jesus himself is referring to the male-female prerequisite for marriage as foundational for all human sexual ethics. And Martin, whether he knows it or not, is saying that Jesus doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes.
And yet he's not my savior. Martin isn't. Martin isn't my Lord. I'm going to go with the one who is my savior and Lord, and not Martin's distorted interpretations of text that are read that mere, I couldn't even call them proof text. That would give them too much credit, because it would suggest that there is actually even a text that could be taken out of context that could be made to say these things. And not even that is possible. He's reading the text completely out of its literary and historical context. He claims that he's doing the opposite, but he really isn't. And he doesn't know the historical context. He doesn't know the literary context. And that comes across time after time in the arguments that he's making.
Well, I want to just get your response real quick to this, and then I'm going to just give you one last quote. What what also frightens me about, and I don't see this going on in any other religious tradition besides Roman Catholicism. Perhaps it's going on in like the what's that one that you talked about, the Unified Church of Christ?
UCC.
Okay, yes.
But also the Episcopalians, some
I don't know.
Anglican
It doesn't seem as organized, because I guess they've accepted homosexuals in the priesthood and all those things. So it's not. I guess the push, the momentum isn't behind it so much, because I guess the goals have already been reached.
But no, it's as much.
Is it? Okay.
Oh yeah, it's all across the heresy. It's always funny when I've spoken in different denominational contexts. If it's a denomination other than my own, they'll say, "Oh, well, you don't understand. We have a different view of it because we're Lutheran, or we're Episcopalian, or we're Methodist, or whatever." And then they'll give their arguments, and I'll say, "You know what? Those are the exact same arguments in the tradition I come out of. For those who want to espouse those kinds of positions, the heresy is no different across the board. The push is no different across the board. It's the same argument, same bad arguments with regard to the biblical text. It doesn't reflect any difference in your respective denominational affiliation."
I think I've articulated it wrong. I guess it seems more forceful in Roman Catholicism, because Roman Catholicism is such a big, it's the largest Christian denomination, and then there's so much money involved behind it. So it just seems like it's much more forceful. So I went to a talk by a Catholic priest who said, this is how you accompany an LGBT child. Number one, you identify the child, and usually they said, well, the child has some sort of non-conforming behavior, non-gender conforming behavior, like you said, alienation from peers, also maybe difficulty at home with parents, loneliness, whatever, depression. Okay, you identify that child, then you gain their trust. That's number two. And then you confirm an LGBTQ identity with that child. And part of that is you do it with this miasma of queer theology, where that child was born that way and they need to be confirmed in that. That's scary to me, because that's also, it's also this blueprint for these misguided people who want to accompany, but it's also a blueprint for like abuse.
Yeah, for me, it's a twofold response to it. One is that it's not a fait accompli. It's not a deterministic model. B, even if it were, and it isn't, it still wouldn't make any difference, because you are not to identify yourself on the basis of impulses that run counter to the will of God. That's not where our identity is. As Christians, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, whatever it is, as Christians, our identity is who we are in Christ.
Right. They'll say, God made me that way, and that's the will of God.
Exactly. I don't excuse my
You could just go in
desires,
circles. Yeah.
Right. By saying God made me a polyamorous. No, he didn't. That's not my identity. God called me to mortify those desires, to die to them, to put them to death. And it's the same thing with same-sex erotic attractions as well. Those are self-dishonoring, indecent impulses which should not be gratified, along with an array of other impulses that should not be gratified, that come from within and defile, as Jesus said, the whole person.
I'll kind of wrap up with this. Here's the end game, what I think, and I think you mentioned it, because you said this is not in his image. This is in Martin's image. This is not a quote from him. I won't burden him with this. It's from another Jesuit here in San Francisco at the University of San Francisco. He said, "Is it less appropriate for gays to imagine Jesus as gay than for African Christians to picture him as Black, Asian Christians as Asian?" That's the end game. Jesus is gay. God's gay.
Yeah. So Jesus becomes little more than a cipher for our own ideology.
Yeah.
We impute our meaning into Jesus, whom we want Jesus to be. Rather than we being shaped in the image of Jesus Christ, conformed to the image of God's Son, which Paul presents in Romans 8 as the ultimate goal of what God is doing on our behalf in Christ, we rather shape Jesus in our ideological image. So what do we call it? There's actually a word for that in the Bible. It's called idolatry. Fashioning an image that we would want God to be, instead of being shaped into God's image by God himself. So Martin just thinks that he's God, or he's at least trying to usurp the functions of God, and define what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and rejecting the teaching of his own Lord.
Yeah, and there are people.
This is why it's more pernicious, in one sense, in the Catholic Church. It's not only because of the size of the Catholic Church and its influence culturally, but it's also because the Catholic Church has a magisterium. I mean, that's one thing Protestants have, to some extent, run away from a little bit. Too much of a magisterium at the top, but if there's a benefit to the magisterium, the benefit is to prevent the heresy from taking hold to its flock. And why are they ensconcing somebody like Martin in a significant position in the Vatican? He's exactly right that this is sending a message about the Vatican's endorsement of his teaching, whether or not the Vatican knows it.
Because
if a magisterium doesn't root out heresy of this sort, there's no point to the magisterium at all.
Ding, ding, ding. That's because I would say a large number of priests share his opinions. I would say the majority of the hierarchy, the bishops and the cardinals, and Pope Francis himself. So this is the direction. And I keep telling Catholics this is the direction the Catholic Church is going in, whether they like it or not. So
yeah, I'm just hoping that when this Pope Francis leaves, that they'll replace him with somebody
it'll be somebody worse, probably somebody that he appointed. People keep waiting. Yeah, I think they're waiting for Pope Pius XIII, and it's just not going to happen. I'm sorry.
It's sad. It's a sad story.
It is. I would have liked to remain in the Catholic Church, but I couldn't. Intellectually, I couldn't, and mentally, I couldn't, because I don't believe in what they're teaching. And people tell me that, well, this isn't what the Catholic Church is teaching. But I go, well, I talk to Catholic priests, I talk to Catholic bishops, I go to their conferences, I go to their symposiums, I go to their lectures. This is what they're teaching. And you're telling me that's not what they're teaching? It's what they're teaching. You might not like it, but it's what.
Exactly. It's the irony. I can't return to Catholicism because there are some things that I believe that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't teach.
Right.
And because I believe it differs is a bit more biblical, more scriptural than some of the teaching of the Catholic Church. But yet, you have priests high up in the Catholic Church teaching things that are against the historic teaching of the Catholic Church. And they're in the leadership position, and they're getting away with it. I don't get that. I just don't get it. So a person who's not at the leadership level can't enter unless they sign off on all the teaching of the Catholic Church. But their leadership does not subscribe to a lot of that teaching themselves.
No, it's not. It's frustrating for somebody like me, because here I am. I don't have an education like you do in the Bible and theology, even philosophy. I don't have any background in it. But I'm just somebody that I'm, like I said, I'm an experiment. I lived the gay experiment, and I ruined myself. And here I'm saying, hey, don't go this way, and my voice is not heard. So it's very.
Yeah, you should be the person that they're inviting all over the different venues in the Catholic Church.
It's not once, not at all.
I know. It's unbelievable. I just can't understand why the magisterium doesn't take advantage of your knowledge of this issue in that way and experience. I just don't get it. It's a mystery to me, because many do subscribe to, at least claim to subscribe to, the position about a male-female requirement for sexual relationships. And yet it's like they're holding their noses and they don't really want to advocate for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's no, I don't want to keep you any longer because you've been so generous with your time. But and no insult to the good priests that I know. I don't know really any good bishops, probably one or two. But the Catholic presbyterate is homosexual. So it's just the way it is. They'll talk about this topic in a welcoming, accompanying sort of way. But if they want to talk about it in a tough love kind of way, no, we don't think so.
Right. Yeah, and that's unfortunate, because that's what the early church would have done. You know, it's not accidental that the one position where Paul demands that a church institute church discipline on a member is on the issue of sexual morality.
Yeah.
And the case of the incestuous man, which again is the closest parallel you can get to the issue of homosexual practice. And it's quite clear Paul's position is, look, you should be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
You should be mourning this guy.
Yeah.
But where do you mourn? You mourn at a funeral.
Yeah.
This is where this guy is heading. He's heading towards exclusion from the kingdom of God. Paul introduces a vice list at the end of chapter 5. He restates that vice list in 1 Corinthians 6, adding a few more vices mostly to flesh out what he means by the sexually immoral, the adulterers, persons who are engaged in homosexual practice. And he's quite insistent at this point. This person, if he continues on this path of sexual immorality, will be excluded from the kingdom of God. If you really loved him, if you really cared about him, you know what you would do? You would put him on church discipline right now.
Right.
Because he's in a position right now that he thinks it's a tolerable condition of life.
Yeah.
And maybe even one to be celebrated. But instead, you boast in your ability to tolerate his behavior. You brag about it.
Yeah.
You're bragging about a form of behavior that leads to his exclusion from God's eternal kingdom. So Paul says, you know what? I've had enough. In the name of the Lord Jesus, put him out of the community and not even eat with such a one.
Amen. Until
he repents and comes to his senses. Now that can sound hard.
No.
But you wouldn't see it as hard if you understood the degree of self-destruction that's involved in the behavior. You know, I use the example of children and parents. If your child is about to touch a hot stove or walk across a heavily trafficked highway,
you stop them.
With the lights not turning, right? You're not a good parent if you say, oh, they're there, knock yourself out and experiment. No, state social services will take your child away from you and count your so-called tolerance as child abuse. Well, that's what's happening in the church today. There's a lot of abuse going on because people are not saying the things they need to say to deter people from the kind of conduct that has permanent repercussions. And when I say permanent, I don't just mean for this life, I mean for eternity.
Yeah.
And true love will do that. Jesus had lots of hard things to say. He had lots of words of judgment. About a third of all Jesus's teaching, actually more than that, what am I saying? Closer to about 40 to 50% of all Jesus's teaching contains an important component of judgment. And that's because if you continue on a certain path, that path leads to destruction. And Jesus is trying to prevent people from getting there.
Yeah.
Even tax collectors, exploitative tax collectors, like Zacchaeus. Jesus eats with him, fraternizes with him, celebrates with him, but he makes quite clear he doesn't diminish his teaching about the seriousness of economic exploitation of others. He's very down on that, continues to criticize it. And it's only when Zacchaeus comes to the point of saying, if I've defrauded anybody, I'll pay them back several times over, that Jesus says, then the kingdom of God has come to this household. But until he repents and turns from that behavior, it can never happen to him. The same thing with the prodigal son. The prodigal son comes back from his dissolute life, including on spending on prostitutes.
Yeah.
He comes back and he says, you know what? I'm not even worthy to be called a son. If my father just treats me as a hired hand, it will be enough. And so he's showing repentance. The very act of returning is a metaphor of repentance. And when he comes in front of his father, he doesn't insist on the other half of the inheritance. He simply says, I'm not even worthy to be your son. I'll take whatever you have for me.
Exactly.
The father celebrates because this is all I wanted. I'm not here to take a pound of flesh out of my son for the bad things that he did. All I'm concerned about is the one who is lost is now found, and the one who is dead now lives. And without that repentance, a person remains lost and dead. And what Martin is doing is proclaiming a gospel of lostness and death, where he's trying to keep people in a status of being lost in relation to their Heavenly Father. Yeah. And dead in their sins. And that, while it has the veneer of love in this society, functional hate. Yeah. And the church has got to wake up. The church is not a Rotary Club or any other fraternal organization, as good as those organizations are. The church is in the business of saving souls by any means necessary. And this is what the church is not doing on the area of sexual ethics. At all. They're playing a game that has eternal ramifications for its participants. And this is to the shame of the church. And Amen. I, for one, on the day of judgment, do not want to stand before my Lord and Maker and hear him say, not well done. Yeah. What you should have said, you didn't say. Why didn't you say it? Well, I didn't want people to be upset with me, Lord. And you know, I wanted to preach your gospel of love. You didn't preach it, God said. Because love means caring enough to confront others when they're engaged in behavior harmful to themselves and others. You know that second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself? The context for that in Leviticus 19:17 and the first part of the verse 18 from which that commandment is derived. You shall not hate your neighbor. You shall not hold a grudge against your neighbor. You shall not take revenge against your neighbor. But if your neighbor does wrong, you shall reprove your neighbor, lest you incur guilt for failing to warn them. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Yes. This is what we're not doing. We don't have a full orbed understanding of love. We're not reproving or rebuking our neighbor when our neighbor is doing wrong. What does Jesus say in Luke 17, echoing this context? He says, if your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him, even if he sins 7 times a day, the same sin. Or in Matthew 18, 70 times 7 or 77 times. Forgive him. That's love. That's grace. A person repeatedly sins, but they repent repeatedly. They must be forgiven. But what Martin is trying to do is give the forgiveness without the repentance. And that leads to the destruction of the offender. So he does not love. Shamefully, Martin is a person who is peddling functional hate to others by leaving them in a condition that will bring their judgment. Yeah, beautiful. I'll just say one last thing. When I outreach to the secular gays, and I've talked to some people who are pretty extreme, like they've got horns coming out of their forehead, you know, and I can have a discussion with them, not spiritual, but they'll just say, you know, if I get a little deeper with them, they'll say, you know, my childhood was, you know, awkward or different. Maybe this does have something to do with, but when you get into the queer theory, the queer theologian crowd, no, because they've been fed that stuff that God made me this way. And that's where the real hate comes from, not from these secular gays. The real hate comes from the gay Christians, because they feel that, hey, God made me this way and you're going against God. So that's really right. Tough. And God never made anyone to be erotically attractive to what they already are. I mean, that's an absurdity that he's spouting. Really, God made me to be sexually aroused by the distinctive features of my own sex,
yes,
which I already possess.
yes.
That's either narcissism or it's sexual self-deception, because it's failing to see that I actually have what I'm attracted to in another.
Yeah. Where I knew that was wrong is when I destroyed my body. And I said, God had never willed me to do this, because I can't believe that that was a loving God.
That's right. God must be a pretty perverse being to create human beings in their binary capacity, fully complemented by the other sex, but then leaving some people be attracted to the same sex in a union that can't possibly be ultimately healthy for their identity.
Ding, ding, ding. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gagnon. You're rational, you're logical, which is something that's often missing in Roman Catholicism. God bless you, but I think you're also a very compassionate. I think you've just shown me compassion here today by spending so much time and sharing your thoughts and the truth with everyone. So I will place a link to Dr. Gagnon's books in the video description. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and you can also direct them to www.robgagnon.net, which I put some art. It's been a while since a couple of years since I've supplemented anything there, but there's lots of great material there that they can also get for free in addition to the published works. And let me say before I go that I don't normally do these kinds of things, but I did it for you because of my enormous respect that I have for you, your courage, your integrity, your truthfulness, your love, your honesty. And so I have great regard for you, and that's why I came on.
Wow, thank you. I know you don't do these, and I've been trying to talk to you for years, and you did say yes. So I'm like, oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You notice also I went on a lot longer than I was projecting.
Wow, way longer. Just for everybody at home, I did tell Professor Gagnon that it'd be about an hour. Thank you.
God bless you, Joseph.